You have a new newsletter out called Home and Away on Substack. You write today about this subject. And one of the things you warn about is if Israel, in fact, goes into Gaza, it could create more problems than it solves. Explain.
Well, don't get me wrong, David. I believe Israel should get involved in Gaza. It should go after those who undertook these heinous, barbaric acts. It's important to say that terrorists cannot act with impunity. Israel also needs to restore deterrence, rebuild its defenses, which obviously failed. But to go in really big, I do worry would cause at least as many, if not more, problems than it would solve. You'd create a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians and for Hamas, because there would inevitably be all sorts of civilian casualties. Israel itself would take many more casualties. Its military, some of them would be abducted. I worry this could become the grounds for war widening, that in Lebanon and other places, Iran, using Hezbollah there, would take this as something of an opportunity. I think the United States, which has been rightfully so supportive of Israel up to now, would be pressured to rethink its position, maybe call for a ceasefire. So Israel really needs to think about what it does. The good news, Israel does have options, and I would say what it ought to do is really two things. It ought to go in, but very discreetly. Where it has intelligence, go after those Hamas fighters. Could be very targeted on them. Could be from the air, could be from the ground with small units. Secondly, rebuild your defenses. They failed. Rebuild the walls, put troops there, increase your readiness. Don't underestimate Hamas ever again. But in Western Israel, be prepared potentially for next time, if only because you don't want there to be a next time.
Talk about the specific objective of any sort of invasion of Gaza. It's understandable that Prime Minister Netanyahu must act, as you say. What was done by Hamas is beyond inexcusable. It's just inconceivable what happened. At the same time, the Prime Minister has said he wants to eliminate Hamas. Is that a realistic objective in Gaza?
Short answer is no. It's going to be very hard to find Hamas. It's not like it's an army in an open battlefield with tanks and planes and the rest. It doesn't work that way. Also, Hamas is as much a movement or network. It's even an idea, David. So it's not just that you're going to create all sorts of resistance. Remember Donald Rumsfeld's quote when we were using drones to kill terrorists? How do we know we're not creating more future terrorists than the ones we're getting? I think that would come into play. So Hamas or some organization like it, some movement like it, will survive, might even be stronger afterwards. And as the Israelis learned in many places, in Lebanon or in Gaza historically, easier to get in than it is to get out. And when you get out, how do you know you could put something better that endures in its place? So again, Israel needs to act, but it needs to act smart. It needs to act in a really careful way.
You know Gaza. You've been to Gaza City. You know how difficult that terrain is, as it were. It's so densely populated, so many buildings. One of the objectives here is to rescue the hostages, of which we don't know how many there are, but upwards of 100 at least hostages. Is that realistic? Is it conceivable that they could go in and actually rescue the hostages?
Really hard to rescue hostages. You need totally good intelligence. Then you need total surprise. That's loading assumption on assumption. I think the more likely way the hostages get out is there's a swap. You've got hundreds of Hamas operatives in Israeli prisons, thousands of Palestinians from the West Bank who the Israelis have charged with crimes. So I think if there's an exchange here, that would be the way it would work. Indeed, David, one of the reasons I would argue, one of the two reasons Hamas took so many hostages was, one, to deter Israeli attacks, but secondly, to set up this kind of a swap.
Richard, you mentioned the possibility of expanding this conflict beyond Israel and Gaza. And obviously, this is first and foremost a humanitarian issue, a tragedy, an inconceivable tragedy. It also has potential economic ramifications, particularly if there's expansion. What about, you mentioned Lebanon, you mentioned particularly Iran, because a lot of people on Wall Street are very concerned if this goes, for example, to involve Iran, then it could really have substantial economic effects.
Well, they ought to be worried about that, and that's why, again, it's so important this not widen. I think the United States ought to let Iran know that it will be held accountable for anything that Hezbollah does. Hezbollah is not an independent entity. I think we maybe ought to get the Chinese involved. China is the principal importer of Iranian oil. If the Chinese don't want to see that oil flow interrupted by American arms, they may want to lean on Iran to rein in Hezbollah. There's things we can and should do here, because this could grow in other ways too, David. You can imagine Arab regimes around the region threatened potentially by public unrest if things get bad enough in Gaza. So in the Middle East, one of the rules of history, as bad as things get, they can always get worse. That ought to be one of our goals here. By our, I mean the United States and Israel, to manage this.
Richard, you are a career diplomat, and from what I've read of history, typically these things are resolved ultimately through some sort of agreement, not through out-and-out war and destruction of the other side. It's too early to really move forward, I'm sure, on diplomacy, but it may not be too early to think about what that might look like down the road and position ourselves.
I think you have to think about tranches or phases. We talked about one, which is a prisoner for hostage swap. I can imagine some kind of a ceasefire or a modus vivendi agreement. The big question, though, is how do you make some progress on the Palestinian issue? Wildly optimistic, ambitious, I get it. But I think what we've learned, David, is normalization between Israel and Arab governments can only go so far. It can't survive, if you will, absent or apart from the Palestinians totally. There's got to be a Palestinian dimension to this. It won't be with Hamas. They have ruled themselves out for time immemorial. But Israel needs a Palestinian partner. Israel needs a Palestinian state, not as a favor to the Palestinians, as a favor to itself. If Israel is going to remain a democratic, Jewish, secure, prosperous state, it needs a Palestinian state that's willing to coexist with it peacefully. That has to be the long-term goal of Israeli and American foreign policy and diplomacy. I know how difficult it is. I spent decades working on it. But I think what we've learned the hard way the last few days, in a vacuum where there is no hope, then if the only game in town is terrorists, terrorists will do what terrorists do. And we can't allow that to be the only game in town.
There are those who speculate, we can't know, certainly I can't know what was really on Hamas's mind, but there are those who speculate part of the triggering event here were reports about a possible arrangement with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. Even at this late date, and understanding Saudi Arabia right now has said they're going to suspend the talks about really reconciling with Israel, is there a potential constructive role for Saudi Arabia in the sort of solution you described?
First of all, I think you're right. I think Hamas, at Iran's behest, probably wanted to interrupt normalization. Hamas also wanted to do its version of station identification. They like to portray themselves as the only Palestinian entity willing and able to take on Israel. Look, Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, MBS, wants to normalize with Israel. He can't in this setting right now. It's too volatile. The Palestinian angle's too uncertain. But, and it's important, but they still want to do it. Saudi Arabia wants the security pact with the United States. They want a nuclear program that the United States supports. So yes, I think we ought to get Saudi Arabia involved, and that could be one of the ways, again, to work with Israel, which wants normalization with Saudi Arabia. That's one of the reasons Israel might need to think more creatively about what they hold out as a possibility to Palestinians who are willing to live with it in peace.